So I get into a little maybe deeper topic here, but talking about plant growth and how they function. So we'll do that, and here's basically what I intend to cover this evening is photosynthesis. I'm going to differentiate between what we call C3 and C4 plants, and talk about mineral cycling, but seed germination, particularly differences again between those C3 and C4 plants, and then plant growth, which requires both energy and meristems or buds to do that, grow with. So physiology is simply the study of how plants function. I've already mentioned, photosynthesis. We'll look at that in some detail. Again, you all have a handout here. Carbon dioxide fixation pathways, again, C3, 4, environmental factors that influence growth, and then water and nitrogen use efficiency. So photosynthesis, you've probably all seen that once upon a time in your life, maybe more than once, some science class or something along that line, where green plants in the presence of sunlight are going to take carbon dioxide and water, and they convert that then to carbohydrates and oxygen. Talks about, what the solar energy oxidizes the water, which releases oxygen. Carbon dioxide is reduced from to form the carbohydrates or the sugars. When you think about it, we didn't have photosynthesis, there wouldn't be any life on Earth. I don't know how plants, anything lives without photosynthesis. It's a pretty important process. So this is a cross-section comparing C3 versus C4. And I guess at this point, I would just say that you think about the C3, we talked about cool season plants. Most of the cool season grasses will have C3 photosynthesis. The warm seasons will have the C4. So you look at this diagram here, and what you see is well, there's some similarities, but there's some differences. I don't know if it shows up in your handout or not. And these mesophyll cells in both of them, these little dots in there, those are the chloroplasts, where the photosynthesis process is going to start. And you see that in both the C3 and the C4. But a difference here is in what's called the bundle sheath cell, those cells that kind of surround a vein. In those sort of plants, there are no chloroplasts in the C3, in those bundle sheath cells, and yet there are over here in the C4. Well, C3 requires there's just one enzyme involved, and that enzyme we'll talk about here in a little bit. The C4 has two different enzymes. The Calvin cycle, which involves the ribulose diphosphate, is in the C3 and in the bundle sheath cells of the C4. The C4 plant has another enzyme called carboxylase that releases or works on in the photosynthetic process. So this table kind of summarizes that. So the C3, the carbon dioxide is fixed by that Rubisco. That's the enzyme out there in the mesophyll cells. In the C4, on the mesophyll cells, the carbon dioxide is actually captured then by carboxylase and different enzymes. And then what this process here with the Rubisco takes place over here in the bundle sheath cells in the chloroplast. So two enzymes involved with C4 and just the one with the C3. The other important thing, there's lots of information here. The other thing I'll point out, because it has a lot to do with how efficiently these plants fix carbon, is C3 plants basically have photorespiration, which is going to be a loss of carbon from the plant. The C4 plants don't have that. Thus, they're usually going to be considerably more efficient. Another table here. Never gone back and changed the metric units, because its numbers tell you some differences here. So again, I got C4, that's warm season. C3 is a cool season. Light saturation, so that's the light intensity at which these different kinds of plants fix the carbon. And you notice it's a higher number there with the C4 plants. They maximize their photosynthetic rate at a high light intensity. Right? C3 plant, they do well in shade because they maximize that photosynthetic rate at a lower light intensity. So they would have a competitive advantage in shaded conditions. And you can see the differences there in the numbers. Again, why C3 and C4? I'm sorry, why that has to do with the number of carbon. We point that out. why cool and warm season, what goes optimum temperatures. So the warm seasons, like what we have here in the late summer still, 90, 95 degrees, they'll do just fine. Cool seasons, they're produced primarily in the spring or early summer, and maybe again in the fall, temperatures are lower. So the differences there. Photosynthetic rates. On average, C4 plants have about twice the photosynthetic rate that C3 plants do. Transpiration ratio, in this one, gives you grams of water per gram carbon dioxide fixed. Another way, maybe it's an easier way to think about that, other than the sheer number, see higher number with the C3 takes more water. Right? Another way to think of that is how many pounds of water does it take to produce a pound of forage? It takes more water for that C3 plant. And they're near as efficient in that regard. Nitrogen use efficiency, you might think about that one a little bit because it says high warm season. That doesn't mean they need high fertility. It means that they're just more efficient in using what nitrogen is available. If we were to fertilize a warm season grass versus the cool season, back in eastern Kansas where we have a smooth brome, fall fescue, things like that, well, we might put on 75 to 100 pounds to get a pretty good response. A warm season, like our native upland hay meadows or something like that, or primarily warm season, blue stems, etc., 30, 40 pounds is all it takes. They're a lot more efficient in using that nitrogen. Okay. 2 or 3 different kinds of cycles I wanted to bring your attention. One of them is the water cycle, hydrologic cycle. Again, lots of information here. And again, of course, as rain drop falls to the soil, the amount of vegetation on that soil surface is important, to capture, reduce the impact of the raindrop so it doesn't hit the soil directly. Didn't remember this morning, might have talked a little bit about that, and Dr. Owens, being a colleague of mine, he always said, that raindrop action's like an elephant walking around in high heels. It's pretty severe, right, if it hits the soil surface. And of course, again, if you don't have litter or plant material there to capture that, a lot of it's going to run off. You have the litter and plant materials there, then it's going to infiltrate into this soil. And, it hopefully gets absorbed by the roots. Some of it, depending on your soil type, sandy soils, or some of it gets deeper drainage. That becomes important. So that interception of rainfall is pretty important as we think about the plant use. And there's lots of other factors. A lot of these are soil factors here that all affect that hydrologic cycle. I'm not going to get on that too much. Somebody today, I heard him talking about mob grazing. I don't know who that was, but the idea that you have tremendous pounds of animals out there on an area, and part of that concept is well, hopefully that might increase the organic matter in the soil. I'm not from Missouri, but I haven't seen a lot of data to support that yet, frankly, in our environment. Maybe back east, maybe it's more apt to happen, but I haven't seen it here. But if it would, that increased organic matter in the soil would help with water. That would be true. Other cycle, energy flow, again, goes back to the photosynthetic process, again, here with the green plants intercepting that sun, and then it goes through a food chain, right? So you have consumers that can utilize those plants. That's why we have grazing animals out on the rangeland primarily. Then you can have multiple different organisms in that as consumers, macro and micro consumers. The micro consumers are the decomposers, the microbes. You notice all these living organisms here all respire. Respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. Now you're releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that's energy flow, not a very efficient process. Again, the conversion efficiency here, again, we see is higher for the warm season grasses. And again, that probably goes back to that photorespiration that occurs in the C3 plants. It makes it less efficient. Now that number, I always like to point out, is a different number than the amount of visible light that's involved in the photosynthetic process that actually green plants fix. That's a lower number. And even in the tall grass prairie, I think that's somewhere between 1% to 2% is all that's fixed. Pretty efficient. We wouldn't want a machine like that was that inefficient, right? but that's all that's fixed. And of course, I say visible light because the photosynthesis process primarily uses blue and red light are the two light types that key peaks of photosynthesis. Okay. Other cycle, mineral cycle, and this is really a simplified version. I don't know if we can read what I've got in there, write them in those different boxes if they don't show up. But we'll start in the case of the soil. Let's say we have a nutrient, let's say nitrate. Nitrogen's often a limiting factor in plant growth. So let's say nitrate. It could be phosphate, be another key one. But they're usually going to be in inorganic form. The plant takes that up. And then what happens to that plant? Well, it can be decomposed by itself if it's not passed through an animal, gets back into that litter pool, gets below ground. Then eventually those microorganisms, decomposers in the soil, are going to take there's inorganic form taken up by the plant changes it to an organic form. That's what gets back in the litter. The microorganisms then convert that back from an organic form to an inorganic form so that plants can take it up again. Now, over here on the left, though, we got the consumer. We're talking about rangeland, grazing lands. So that animal consumes that, and that actually speeds up this process. Rather than going this way, if you go through that grazing animal, actually speeds up nutrient cycling. And you think about, as an animal grazes, and of course, it's going to remove some nutrients, in its body tissue, but a lot of it actually gets returned to the soil. Nitrogen primarily in the urine, and phosphorus primarily in the fecal material. But a lot of that's returned. So, again, that the amount of nutrients out there that's needed on rangeland is usually less than, let's say, if we had the same species and we're haying it for some reason, we're removing those nutrients off the site in the hay. We're removing a lot more nutrients that way than if we're putting it into a grazing animal. Yeah, the grazing animal takes some of it, but a lot of it's returned to the soil. Okay, seed germination. Got a maize plant up there. That's a nice grass plant. Got a big seed. So the seed's going to absorb water if it's there, and then we get this emergence of a radical and coleoptile, and you tell by the picture which of those emerges first. Somebody said it. Looks like this radical's coming out of that seed first, right? That radical, that's what becomes the seminal, or what's called, or the primary root system will develop from that radical.